My name is John Dennett. I'm ex-Royal Navy. I served 4.5 years during the Second World War. At the time I was 17 when I joined up. I was an apprentice bricklayer, and during a bad winter in 1941 we were sent underground to build these ammunition factories, and it didn't seem to be the right thing for me, so my friend and I went down to Bristol, volunteered, and within 3 weeks we were on our way to the Navy. That was in March 1942. We did our training. I became a gunner, anti-aircraft gunner, and I was sent to America to pick up the landing craft. And we went to Philadelphia, where it was commissioned. And then at the turn of the year, 1943, we sailed for North Africa, loaded with troops and provisions. And our destination, well, we finished up in Algiers. So the war had moved on along from there. And after we had unloaded our cargo, we picked up other cargo to follow the 8th Army along the coast, which was Sfax and Sousse. And as they moved forward, so the landing craft come up behind them, giving them more provisions. And finally we finished up in Tripoli, where that's when the war was ended in North Africa, when they had cleaned the Germans out. We were designated to carry aviation fuel into Malta, and so we just took loads of aircraft fuel in jerry cans into Malta, and I think it was just after that time they give us a few days leave in Tunis to recharge the batteries, so to speak. Well, during the time of following the army along, with quite a few hairy moments from the dive bombers, because every day you were a target for them, because the airfields were in Sicily, which was quite close to North Africa, and it was from there that they were pounding Malta, who were struggling. Anyhow, when it got to, I think September 43, it was September, I think, yeah. We invaded Sicily. They'd gathered the troops in North Africa and all the different things, and we landed in Sicily, and the Yanks landed on the beach around the corner, and then between them they marched through Sicily, and it wasn't a difficult landing, because I think we took them by surprise, and it was only aircraft was the biggest trouble. There were no gun sights or anything to fire back at you. It was mainly aircraft having a pot at you, so they did little damage really. And so the armies proceeded through that period, and they got into Italy via the Messina Straits. Our next real landing was Salerno, and we loaded up in North Africa, Bizerta I think it was, and we went to Salerno, and that was quite hairy. The 88s of the Germans were in the hills, and they were plopping shells around you, and I think we were lucky not to have been hit. And that, once again, aircraft were the biggest trouble, because during that period we were shooting at a Messerschmitt, and the poor old Spitfire that was following in, he come down instead. But the pilot survived, and he came along the beach saying, what the hell's happening? But it was nice to see him alive, with a bit of a sense of humour, so to speak. But you get so close to one another that And if you're firing at something and the speed they go, it's unfortunate, because our little guns are only deterrents really for anti-aircraft fire, but they seem to do the trick. But if you come low enough, it'll prove fatal for them. Where do we go from there? Oh, our next assignment was Anzio. That was in January 1944, and we loaded up in Naples and headed along, and we took American Rangers in there who were supposed to be their crack troops. Well, when they landed on the beachhead, they took their time to move off of it. Consequence being, the bigger ships like ourselves were waiting in the bay with all the tanks. So we were getting a pounding from the aircraft, and it took almost, well, I think it was a week before things actually slowed down a bit. And during that time we lost ships. There was also sunk a hospital ship, St. John, and they had midget torpedo boats which were nibbling away at different boats. But that went on for a couple of months, that back and forward to Anzio from Naples, and bringing supplies to them. And then I think in March we headed back to England, and I arrived in Liverpool in April 1944, and we were put in dock for a bit of overhaul and whatnot, and that's where I met my wife. We arrived in Birkenhead docks and docked up. Went to the nearest pub, which was the Eagle on the dock road, and then off to the dance hall as sailors do, and that's what happened. And I met my wife, and she gave me tea and wads at the dance, and I kept in touch with her through DDay and all that, and later in life we got married in 1947, so that was a blessing for coming to Liverpool. So at the moment I'm an adopted Scouser. But DDay, it was something I'll never forget. But with the volume of ships that were on the water at that night, you couldn't see anything happening to you, because you thought to yourself, well, what can happen other than, you know, getting sunk on. But the actual landing to DDay, the first assault, when they bore the brunt of that, we were laying off, and we went ashore about 10:30. The initial assault was about 6:30, I think. And by the time they'd formed their beachhead up and that, we were able to get ashore with tanks and that at 10:30. But it meant we had to stay on all night because of the tide. And then they kept going back to the land or to Portsmouth or Southampton, whichever the case was. You took prisoners of war back, you brought provisions back and more tanks. We used to bring loads of fresh bread for those that were on the beaches, because the beach party had to fend for themselves, more or less, rely on the ships feeding them. So we had sacks of fresh bread for them, because at the time, like, we hadn't seen fresh bread not until we got back to England, so it was really good, I suppose, for them. But and then we carried wounded. As the wounded accumulated, we had, well, you could accommodate 200 stretchers in the tank deck, and we had a little operating theatre. It carried about 3 doctors and the staff that go with them, which was extra to our normal crew. But what would happen if the walking wounded were good enough to be sent back up the front, they just got patched up, But anything that was too bad we took back, and there were always ambulances waiting for you. Well, I kept going back and forward to the various beaches up until about August, I think it was, yeah. And I had a chance to get off the boat for take a second gunnery course, and that's what I did. After I'd served my gunnery course, I went on an aircraft carrier called the HMS Patroller, which was convoying in the Atlantic at the time, and then she got loaded up to go to Burma with aircraft, and they thought, aye, because at the time the kamikaze pilots was having a go at aircraft carriers, so I don't think we were looking forward to it. And we were in Glasgow loaded when it came through that the war in Japan or out that way had finished. And so that was a day to remember. And I got put into barracks to be demobbed. And then while I'm waiting in the barracks, they needed a gunner on a minesweeper, so I was on one of them for 6 months. I didn't come out until June 1946, so, but I'm proud to have served in the Royal Navy. I'm one of the lucky ones who come home. I've enjoyed a good life of freedom, and that's what we fought for. And we must never forget the lads who didn't come back. They're the heroes. They gave their life. And some poor mother's son. So we must always remember them.